A sudden dizzy spell, a forgotten word, a moment of weakness you blame on a poor night's sleep. We brush these small things off every day. But what if they aren't random glitches? What if they are a countdown? A series of quiet, desperate warnings from your own body, screaming that a disaster is only days or even hours away. The most dangerous part is that these warnings often disappear, leaving you feeling perfectly fine. This is the silent trap that catches so many. Today, we're going to tell you a story about these silent warnings and the man who chose to ignore every single one until the final echo. This is a story that could save a life. So before we begin, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. The information you're about to hear is something everyone needs to know. The pruning shears made a satisfying snip. Arthur Vance felt a small sense of victory with each clean cut. There was a right way and a wrong way to prune a rosebush. The wrong way was to hack at it, leaving jagged wounds. The right way was precise, a clean, angled cut just above the bud union. It was a small thing, but it was a matter of order, of control. And Arthur's life, especially now, was built upon a foundation of order and control. He knelt on his foam pad, his focus narrowed to the branch in front of him. He had been a history professor for 40 years, a man who dealt in timelines, in cause and effect, in the structured narrative of the past. Retirement hadn't changed that. It had simply shrunk the classroom to the size of his life. His schedule was his syllabus: breakfast at 8, a walk at 9, reading until lunch. And in the afternoon, the garden. The garden was his quiet battleground, the one place where he could impose perfect, logical order on the chaos of nature. With another decisive snip, the deadwood fell away. He gathered the clippings, his movements deliberate and economical. Time to stand up. He placed one hand on his knee, leveraging his weight as he had 1,000 times before, and pushed himself upright. That's when it happened. The world did not spin. It tilted. It tilted hard, like a photograph falling from a nail. The solid ground beneath his feet suddenly felt like the deck of a ship in a heavy swell. His balance, something he had taken for granted for 72 years, simply vanished. The crisp sound of the wind in the distant trees disappeared, replaced by a dull, pulsing hum that seemed to originate from inside his own head. A gasp caught in his throat. He took a clumsy step backward, his gardening boot catching on nothing. His arms flailed for a moment, two useless wings in a sudden silent freefall. His right hand shot out, finding something solid and rough to steady himself against. His knuckles scraped, but he barely felt it. He was too busy fighting the bizarre sensation of gravity, shifting its allegiance. His eyes were wide open, but his focus was gone. Everything was a blur, a watercolor painting left out in the rain. He squeezed his eyelids shut, a sailor bracing for a rogue wave. And then, as quickly and as inexplicably as it had come, it was over. The world snapped back into place with an almost audible click. The ground was firm and reliable once more. The sound of the wind returned, rustling through unseen leaves. The dull hum in his head faded to silence. Arthur stood perfectly still, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He took a deep, shuddering breath, then another. "What in God's name was that?" he whispered to the empty air. He slowly released his grip on the solid surface, flexing the fingers of his right hand. They worked. He looked down at his feet, planted firmly on the ground. They felt steady. He cautiously turned his head to the left, then to the right. No tilt, no hum, nothing. The professor in him took over, the part of his brain that demanded a rational explanation for everything. Analysis, hypothesis, conclusion. "A head rush," he said aloud, his voice sounding thin but firm. That's all it was. He had been kneeling for the better part of an hour. He had stood up too quickly. It was simple physics, a matter of blood flow and equilibrium. It happened to people all the time. It meant nothing. But even as he formed the logical explanation, a cold prickle of unease traced its way down his spine. It had felt like more than a simple head rush. It had felt profound. A fundamental failure of the systems that had run his body flawlessly for decades. A new thought, sharp and unwelcome, pierced through his analysis. What if someone saw? He scanned the perimeter of his property. He saw nothing. No one. The relief that washed over him was immediate and surprisingly intense. The thought of a neighbor, of his friend David Chen from next door, seeing him stumble and flail like a feeble old man was somehow more terrifying than the physical sensation itself. That was a loss of control of a different kind. That was a crack in the foundation of independence he had so carefully maintained since Martha had passed. He needed a label for it, something to contain the experience and render it harmless. It was a flicker. Yes, that's what it was. Like a light bulb in an old house during a storm. A momentary dip in power. The light dims, wavers for a second, and then returns to full brightness. It's an annoyance, a momentary glitch in the system. You don't call an electrician for a single flicker. You don't rewire the house. You just wait for it to pass and carry on. Satisfied with his metaphor, Arthur bent down, slowly this time, and picked up his pruning shears. The metal felt cool and solid in his hand, a reassuring weight. He found another dead branch, positioned the blades, and squeezed. Snip. The sound was clean. The cut was perfect. He was fine. Everything was under control. Routine was a comfort. It was a silent promise that today would be much like yesterday, and tomorrow would be much like today. For Arthur, Tuesdays and Thursdays meant lunch at the Anchor Diner. The familiar chime of the little bell above the door was the opening note in a predictable and pleasing symphony. The low murmur of conversation, the clatter of ceramic plates on countertops, the sizzle from a grill in the back. "Afternoon, Arthur," a bright voice called out. It was Chloe. She had been working here for a few years, a young woman with a relentlessly cheerful demeanor and an uncanny ability to remember how all her regulars took their coffee. "Chloe," Arthur replied, offering a polite nod as he slid into his usual booth. The vinyl squeaked a familiar welcome. "The usual today." "The Turkey Club and a black coffee?" she asked, already reaching for a mug. "Let's be adventurous today, Chloe," Arthur said, a small smile touching his lips. It was their little ritual, this joke about his unadventurous nature. "I think I'll have a look at the menu." "Watch out, everyone," she said with a laugh. "Professor Vance is living on the edge." She placed the menu in front of him and went to get his coffee. Arthur enjoyed this, the easy banter, the sense of belonging to a place. It was a small but vital part of the structure he had built for his life. He scanned the menu, though he already knew what he would get. He hadn't had a BLT in ages. The simple combination of salty, crisp, and fresh sounded perfect. Chloe returned with his coffee. "Have you braved the culinary frontier yet?" "I have indeed," Arthur announced. "I've decided on the BLT sandwich." He opened his mouth to confirm the order, to say the simple words he had just formed in his mind. But something went wrong, terribly wrong. The thought was there, crystal clear in his head. BLT sandwich. But the signal, the electrical impulse that should have traveled from his brain to his tongue, got lost somewhere along the way. What came out was a thick, clumsy sound. A garbled syllable that was not a word. He mumbled, his tongue feeling foreign and unwieldy in his own mouth. Time seemed to slow down. He saw the flicker of confusion in Chloe's eyes. Her cheerful smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. It was a tiny reaction, almost imperceptible, but to Arthur, it felt like a spotlight had been switched on, illuminating him in a moment of utter failure. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. His heart gave a painful lurch. This was the flicker again, not in his legs, not in his balance, but in his voice, in his mind. He had to fix it. Now, he cleared his throat with a loud, theatrical cough. Ahem. "Forgive me. Something caught in my throat," he said, forcing a smile that felt brittle and fake. He took a short breath, gathered himself, and tried again. He spoke with an exaggerated, almost pained slowness, as if speaking to a child or a foreigner. "I will have the BLT sandwich." He enunciated each letter, each word, with a deliberate force, wrestling it out of his own mouth. The effort was immense, and it left him feeling strangely exhausted. Chloe's professional smile snapped back into place, but her eyes were kind. Too kind. It was the kindness you show someone who is struggling, and it made the shame burn even hotter in Arthur's chest. "Of course, Arthur. 1 BLT coming right up," she said, her tone perfectly normal. She turned and walked away, leaving him alone in the booth with his thundering pulse. He picked up his coffee cup, but his hand was trembling slightly. He had to use his other hand to steady it as he brought it to his lips. He stared out at nothing, the familiar sounds of the diner now seeming distant and muffled. "Fatigue," his mind insisted. "That's all it, Island. You didn't sleep well. Your mind is tired." But the argument felt weak, a lie he was desperately trying to sell to himself. This was different. The incident in the garden had been a physical betrayal. This felt deeper. It was an attack on his very identity. He was a professor. His tools were words, language, the precise and orderly construction of thoughts. For a moment, his tools had been taken from him. When the sandwich arrived, he barely tasted it. Every bite felt mechanical. He felt a sudden, paranoid certainty that everyone in the diner was watching him, whispering about the old man who couldn't even order his own lunch. He ate quickly, left too large a tip on the table, and stood up to leave, avoiding Chloe's gaze as he walked to the register. He paid in cash, mumbled a goodbye, and pushed the door open, the little bell chiming his departure. The cool air outside did nothing to quell the heat in his face. He stood there for a moment, the sounds of the diner fading behind him, leaving him in a profound and terrifying silence. The flicker wasn't just a glitch in his body anymore, it was an intruder in his mind, and it was a much more frightening enemy to face. The morning routine was a ritual, a quiet confirmation that the world was as it should be. The warm water, the rich lather of the shaving cream, the familiar weight of the razor in his hand. It was a process of restoration, of preparing his face to meet the day. Arthur leaned closer to the mirror, tilting his head to get a clean line along his jaw. He was focused, his hand steady. And then, in the space between one breath and the next, the man in the mirror was no longer him. It was a horrifying distortion. The entire left side of his face, the face he had known for 72 years, suddenly gave way. His eye drooped into a weary, vacant stare. The corner of his mouth pulled downward into a grotesque sag, a silent snarl of defeat. It was the face of a stranger, a broken, asymmetrical mask. His breath hitched. The razor froze mid-stroke, hovering an inch from his skin. His heart seized, a cold knot of terror in his chest. He blinked, one hard, convulsive blink, and the face was his again. Normal, symmetrical. The stranger was gone. Arthur stared, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the counter. Had he imagined it? Could his mind conjure such a vivid, terrifying illusion? He splashed his face with cold water, the shock of it a welcome distraction. He looked back up, his eyes scanning every line, every feature of his reflection. It was just him. Just Arthur Vance, looking a little pale. "A trick of the light," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "A shadow. It was just a shadow." He repeated the words to himself, a desperate mantra against the fear. He picked up the razor to finish the job, but his hand was no longer steady. He could still see the distorted face burned into his memory, and as he stared at his own reflection, he was no longer sure who was looking back. The phone rang at precisely 7 o'clock on Sunday evening, just as it always did. The sound, usually a welcome punctuation to his quiet evening, now felt like an alarm. He knew it was Eleanor. He let it ring 3 times before answering, composing his voice. "Hello, sweetheart." "Hi, Dad. How was your week?" Her voice was warm, but carried the familiar, efficient tone of a doctor. "Quiet, productive, no complaints," Arthur said, keeping his tone light. He was a good liar when the stakes were high, and the stakes, he felt, were his entire world. There was a slight pause on the other end. "You sound a little tired. Everything okay?" The question was a sharp probe. A jolt went through him. Can she hear it? Can she hear the cracks in my voice? "Just the usual aches and pains of being 72, he deflected with a small laugh. "The garden is putting up a good fight this year, but tell me about your week. anything exciting at the hospital. He steered the conversation onto her familiar territory, and for a few minutes, he was safe. He listened to her talk about a difficult case, a long shift, the endless hospital politics. He offered the usual fatherly advice, a spectator to her busy life. But as the call was winding down, she circled back. "Dad," she said, her voice softening. "Are you sure you're feeling all right? You just seem a little distant." The lie felt heavy on his tongue. He pictured her face, the worry that would be clouding her eyes. A part of him wanted to tell her everything about the tilt, the lost words, the stranger in the mirror. But a stronger, more stubborn part, the part that defined him, refused. Telling her meant doctors. It meant tests. It meant being looked after. His independence carefully dismantled piece by piece. "Eleanor, I promise you, I am perfectly fine," he said, forcing a warmth he did not feel. "You have enough to worry about without adding your old man to the list." "Okay, Dad," she said, but the resignation in her voice told him she wasn't convinced. "Call me if you need anything. Anything at all. I will. I love you. I love you, too." He hung up and placed the receiver down with a hand that was not quite steady. He had survived the interrogation, but as he stood in the silence of his house, he felt a profound sense of loneliness. He had protected his independence, but he had done so by building a wall around himself, and his daughter was on the other side. The only sounds in the room were the quiet click of the clock and the slide of wooden pieces across the board. The weekly chess match with his neighbor, David Chen, was an intellectual battle Arthur savored. He was in a strong position, his mind clear, methodically cornering David's king. He saw the path to checkmate in 5 moves. He leaned forward, studying the board for his final assault. That's when the darkness came. It started at the edge of his right eye, a creeping grey shadow that bled inward, like ink dropped in water. It wasn't a loss of light. It was a loss of information. The intricate carving of David's knight became a blurry smudge. The sharp lines separating the squares dissolved. Half the battlefield had vanished. Panic flared in his chest, cold and immediate. He didn't dare blink or turn his head, hoping it would pass. In the confusing, half-visible landscape of the board, he saw what he thought was an opening. He reached for his queen, his most powerful piece, and moved her to a new square with a confident thud. David didn't move for a long moment. Then, his bishop slid silently across the board. It came to rest on the square where Arthur's queen now stood. A capture, a catastrophic blunder. Just as the bishop claimed its prize, Arthur's vision snapped back to perfect clarity. He saw the board as it truly was. His queen gone, his defenses shattered, his path to victory erased. David looked up, his expression not of triumph, but of quiet concern. "Arthur, are you all right? That's not a move you make." The question hung in the air. Arthur felt his face grow warm. He forced a dry laugh. "The light in here is dreadful," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "I completely mistook that bishop for a pawn. A ridiculous mistake." David held his gaze for a second too long, his eyes searching. But he simply nodded. "Checkmate in 3, he said softly. He was right. Arthur stared at the board, but he wasn't seeing the pieces anymore. He was seeing a much larger game, one he was clearly losing. The kettle whistled, signaling the end of another quiet afternoon. Making tea was a ritual that anchored Arthur's day, a small, warm ceremony for one. He moved through the familiar steps, his actions smooth with repetition. He reached into the cupboard for his favorite teacup. It was the last one of the set he and his wife, Martha, had bought on their honeymoon. Its handle was delicate, its rim thin. Holding it felt like holding a conversation with her. He placed a tea bag in the cup and poured the steaming water. As he lifted the cup to carry it to the table, the strength in his right arm vanished. It wasn't a tremor or a spasm. It was a complete and sudden absence of power, as if a switch had been flipped. His fingers, which had been securely gripping the handle, simply went limp. The command to hold on was sent from his brain, but it never arrived. The cup tilted, and for a silent, terrible moment, it seemed to hang in the air before it fell. The sound of it shattering on the tile floor was sharp and violent, Hot tea splashed across his shoes and the floorboards. Arthur didn't move. He didn't flinch from the heat. He just stared down at the wreckage. White fragments, like broken bones, were scattered in the spreading brown pool of tea. The delicate handle, the one Martha had loved, was lying in 2 clean pieces. It wasn't the mess that held him motionless. It was the finality of it. The other incidents, the dizziness, the slurred words, the tricks of the eye, had been fleeting moments he could dismiss. They were ghosts. But this was real. This was tangible evidence lying at his feet. The flicker wasn't just a harmless glitch anymore. It could break things. It had broken the last piece of a memory he could hold in his hands. And as he stared at the shattered remains, he felt a cold dread spread through him. He was breaking, too. The house was quiet. Arthur was in his favorite armchair, a thick history book open in his lap. It was a peaceful evening, the kind he had experienced thousands of times before. He turned a page, his mind absorbed in the complex politics of 18th century Europe. Without warning, the peace was annihilated. It was not a headache. A headache is a slow ache, a gradual pressure. This was a detonation, a silent, violent explosion of pain erupted behind his eyes, as if a bolt of lightning had struck the inside of his skull. The book fell from his hands, landing with a soft thud on the floor. A strangled gasp escaped his lips. His hands flew to his head, pressing against his temples as if he could physically contain the agony. The pain was absolute, a white hot spike that consumed every thought, every sensation. The room swam in a blurry haze, and a wave of nausea rose in his throat. For what felt like an eternity, but was likely only a minute, the pain was his entire world. There was no past, no future, only the blinding, crushing pressure. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the searing intensity receded. It left behind a dull, throbbing ache, like the echo of a scream. Arthur uncurled himself from the chair, his body trembling. A cold sweat slicked his skin. He sat there, gasping in the quiet room, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. There was no rationalization for this. No trick of the light, no frog in his throat. This was not a flicker. This was a thunderclap. It was the sound of something inside him breaking apart. And in the ringing silence that followed, Arthur's denial was finally gone, burned away by the pain. All that remained was a pure, cold certainty. He was in terrible danger. He sat in the dark, the dull throb in his head, a constant, grim reminder. The fear was no longer a flicker. It was a cold, heavy weight in his chest. Denial was a luxury he could no longer afford. There was only the truth now, and the truth was terrifying. He closed his eyes, but the events of the past weeks played back in his mind, a series of stark, undeniable warnings. The world tilting sideways in the garden, the jumbled, meaningless sound that was meant to be his lunch order, the sagging, unfamiliar face in the mirror, the grey curtain falling over the chessboard, the sound of his wife's teacup shattering on the floor, and the thunderclap of pain that had just ripped through his skull. Each one had been a quiet echo. Now, together, they were a deafening siren. With a trembling hand, he reached for his laptop and opened it. He didn't search for symptoms this time. He knew the name of his enemy. He typed the words he had been trying to forget since his first search. Transient Ischemic Attack. The screen glowed with articles and medical websites. He read the stark, clinical phrases, each one a hammer blow, a critical warning sign of a future stroke. Blockage is temporary, but the danger is not. Up to a third of thanks in advance patients will have a major stroke within a year. Do not wait. A thanks in advance is a medical emergency. The last line seemed to pulse on the screen. A medical emergency. He thought of Eleanor's voice on the phone, her calm, clear explanation of the F.A.S.T. acronym. T is for time to call for help. His eyes went to the telephone sitting on the small table beside his chair. It looked impossibly far away, impossibly heavy. He pictured it all. The ambulance, the questions, the sterile white walls of a hospital room. He pictured the loss of his routine, his house, his independence. The fear of that future, of being helpless, of being a burden, was a physical barrier. He had all the information. He had the warnings. He knew exactly what he was supposed to do. Arthur reached out and closed the laptop, plunging the room back into darkness. He did not reach for the phone. He just sat there, paralyzed by his fear, waiting. A sudden, sharp ring of the doorbell tore through the quiet house, making Arthur jump. He wasn't expecting anyone. For a moment, he considered not answering, letting whoever it was believe the house was empty. But the bell rang again, more insistent this time. He moved slowly, his limbs stiff with a combination of age and fear. When he opened the door, his breath caught in his throat. It was Eleanor. She stood there with a small, forced smile, but her eyes, a doctor's eyes, were serious and scanning his face. "Hi, Dad," she said softly. "I had a conference cancel nearby. I thought I'd stop in." It was a clumsy lie, and they both knew it. "Eleanor," he said, his voice weaker than he wanted. "What a surprise. Come in." He tried to act normal, offering her a drink, asking about her drive. But his movements were stiff, his smile a mask. The silence between his sentences was heavy with things unsaid. She didn't let the pretense last long. As they sat, she looked at him directly, her gaze both loving and clinical. "Dad, I'm going to stop pretending," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "I've been worried sick since our last call. You're not yourself. Please, just tell me what's been happening." He opened his mouth to offer another excuse. The garden, a poor night's sleep, the simple burden of age. But she held up a hand. "Before you say anything," she continued, "let me tell you something. It's an acronym we use at the hospital. F.A.S.T. Arthur felt a chill run through him. "F is for face," she said, her eyes fixed on his. "Have you looked in the mirror and felt like one side was drooping, even for a second?" He saw the stranger's sagging face. He said nothing. "R is for arms. Have you felt a sudden weakness in an arm? Maybe dropped something you were holding?" He saw the shattered fragments of his wife's teacup on the floor. "S is for speech. Any trouble finding the right words? Or has your speech sounded slurred, even for a moment?" He heard the jumbled sound he'd made in the diner, the hot shame of it. He looked away, unable to meet her gaze. "And T, Dad," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "T is for time. Time to call for help, because those are the signs of a thanks in advance. A warning." The word hung in the air between them. Warning. It was the same word he'd read on the screen, the same conclusion he had desperately tried to escape. The carefully constructed wall he had built around his fear crumbled. He looked back at his daughter, the protector of his own health, and the weight of his secrets was suddenly too much to bear. "All of them," he whispered, the words choked with a grief and terror he had held inside for weeks. "Eleanor, every single one." Relief, fragile and new, settled in the quiet space between them. For the first time in weeks, Arthur was not alone with his secret. Eleanor's hand was a firm, reassuring weight on his shoulder. He opened his mouth to say something more, to thank her, but the words wouldn't form. A thick, garbled sound was all that came out. A look of confusion crossed his face, followed by a wave of pure terror. He tried again, but his tongue felt thick and useless, his lips refusing to obey his commands. "Dad." Eleanor's voice sharpened, her grip on his shoulder tightening. She saw it happen in an instant. The left side of his mouth, which had been set in a line of weary sadness, sagged into a slack, empty droop. His eye went dull. The F and S's of her own lecture were materializing before her eyes. Panicked by the sudden loss of control, Arthur tried to stand, to push himself up from the chair. His left leg buckled immediately, and he pitched sideways. Eleanor moved instantly, catching him before he could fall, her strength surprising them both. "No, Dad. Sit down." "Sit," she commanded, her voice calm but ringing with an authority that cut through his confusion. She guided his dead weight back into the armchair. "It's okay. I'm right here with you. Just look at me." She never took her eyes off his face as she pulled her phone from her pocket. Her fingers were swift and sure. "Yes," she said into the phone, her voice clipped and professional. "I need an ambulance at 12 Beacon Lane. I'm with my father. He is actively showing signs of a stroke, facial droop, slurred speech, weakness on his left side. I'm a physician. She ended the call and was at his side again, kneeling, taking his trembling hand in both of hers. She said nothing more. There was nothing more to say. In the profound silence of the room, a new sound began, faint at first, then growing steadily louder. It was a siren, wailing in the distance, racing through the evening streets. Time was no longer a word in an acronym. It was a sound, and it was coming for them. The journey was a blur of motion and sound. The piercing wail of the siren, the steady, calm voice of his daughter answering questions from a paramedic, the feeling of his own heart beating a frantic, unsteady rhythm. Arthur felt like a passive observer to his own crisis, aware of everything but in control of nothing. The emergency room was a sudden shock of focused chaos. Faces in scrubs appeared above him, voices asking questions, hands checking his pulse, his blood pressure. Through it all, Eleanor was a constant presence, her hand on his arm, her voice translating the medical language into simple, reassuring truths. Hours later, the chaos subsided. A doctor, a kind-faced woman with tired eyes, stood beside his bed. "You're a very lucky man, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "You had a transient ischemic attack. A thanks in advance. The symptoms you experienced were the result of a temporary blockage of blood flow to your brain." She paused, letting the words sink in. "That blockage cleared on its own. That's why you feel more normal now. But I need you to understand, that was your body's final alarm bell. Many people who have a thanks in advance will have a major, debilitating stroke soon after. You got here in time. Your daughter's quick action likely saved you from permanent brain damage." The doctor looked at him intently. "We have a saying, time is brain. Every second that blood flow is blocked, millions of brain cells die. You didn't lose those seconds. You've been given a second chance." Arthur looked at Eleanor, whose face was a mixture of exhaustion and profound relief. He understood. The fear that had paralyzed him for weeks finally dissolved, replaced by a wave of startling clarity. He hadn't lost his independence in that ambulance. He had been given a chance to reclaim it. 3 months later, the rhythm of Arthur's life was different. It was still a life of order and routine, but the purpose had shifted. The morning now began, not with gardening, but with the soft whir of a blood pressure cuff. His meals were no longer just for sustenance, but a deliberate choice for his health. His independence was no longer defined by a stubborn refusal of help, but by the powerful, daily act of taking care of himself. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet vigilance. The story ends on a Thursday afternoon. Not in a diner, but in a small community center meeting room. Arthur stands before a small group of his peers. He is not a professor delivering a lecture on history. He is a man telling his own story. "It started with what I called a flicker," he says, his voice clear and steady. "A moment of dizziness I dismissed. Then there were other warnings, lost words, a shattered teacup. Each one was a quiet echo. I chose to ignore them because I was afraid of what they meant." He looks around the room, meeting the eyes of the other people there. "I learned that true strength isn't about pretending you're fine," he continues. "It's about being brave enough to listen when your body is telling you something is wrong. It's about being brave enough to ask for help. That single act of courage can be the difference between a warning and a tragedy." He had survived the silent warnings, and now he had become the voice of one, hoping that someone else might listen. Arthur's story is a fictional journey, but the message at its heart is a very real and personal one for me, and I hope for you as well. In our lives, it's so easy to dismiss the small things. A moment of unusual fatigue, a brief dizzy spell, a word we can't quite find. We call it stress, or aging, or just a bad day. We are often so determined to be strong for ourselves and for our families that we ignore the very signals our bodies send to protect us. But what I believe this story shows is that true strength isn't about ignoring vulnerability, it's about paying attention to it. Taking a moment to learn these signs and having the courage to act on them is not a sign of weakness. It is one of the most powerful and positive acts of self-love and family love that we can perform. It's about giving yourself the best possible chance for a long, healthy future with the people who matter most. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Stay vigilant, stay informed, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.